a system that can fit everything. And so I just started doing it the way that I do it now. And it's nothing secret. There's nothing super spooky about it. It's just sort of a process. And that's what I'm going to talk to you guys about today. Like, from Jump Street, what's important to know about the wind, what's the first things to kind of look at, and how to apply that directly. So, and it's nothing really advanced. I'm just sort of packaging information that I've learned all my life. You know, one of the wind things that I learned was like some 85-year-old dude South Africa, right? So there's really nothing new under the sun. It's just sort of how you synthesize it and package it. Goes your own little algorithm inside your brain. So I've got some optics here from Vortex. I'm partnering with Vortex here. Me personally, I'm from Capstone. That's all those brands. So I work for Burger Bullets. I work for Lapua. I work for Vitavori. And I work for SK. So all those brands are one company. One big company owns all those companies, and I work for that big company. So you guys have specific questions afterwards or whatever, grab me. Want to talk about Burger, Lapua, Vitavori. I hope you try those products if you can find them. Right. But I really want to thank Vortex for supplying all the optics here. And I am going to talk about some of their specific products and how it helps me do my job reading wind, especially these Vortex Fury binos. These things are like Star Trek. For real. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay. So, I don't have my trusty whiteboard this year, but I'll do it without the whiteboard. So, a couple things. When you go out to shoot, you have to think about, there's a couple things you need to really think about. Number one, you have to have stability of your platform. Number two, you have to have a good zero. What's a zero? Zero is, hey, my sights are pointed, that's where the shot hits. Again, that's usually at short range, 100 yards, 100 meters, whatever the flavor, right? So you're taking the uncertainty out, right? Like, I typically wouldn't want to go and get a zero on my rifle and say 600 or 800 yards, because there might be other effects that are influencing where the bullet's hitting. So I want to have high confidence that where I'm pointing the rifle, where I'm pointing the sights, that's where the bullet ends up. You have to have that. You have to have a good, stable platform. Okay, in the modern army, you can't say the word fundamentals anymore. It's a new F word, but you have to have a stability of a platform. So your trigger manipulation cannot disturb that barrel, right? And all that stuff, that's all marksmanship. If you don't have marksmanship, none of this matters. Okay? I see some youngsters, I'm trying to keep it at least PG-13, but if you suck, no amount of wind reading stuff is going to help you. Right? Suck. Don't suck. That's what I've trained Olympians. And the number one thing you ask anybody that ever shot for me was like, what did Prazak say to you? Hey man, try not to suck. So, and the takeaway from there is every time you guys go out and shoot, whether it's zeroing or testing loads or whatever, spend some time on marksmanship. Don't get so focused and sucked into where the bullet hits and trying to solve all those things. Oh, well, I'm a little high, but that is wrong. Oh, I'm left to right, wind call, spin drift, whatever. Spend time on marksmanship, okay? Spend a little time dry firing before you start shooting. See what your position looks like. Spend time to try to improve your position wherever you're at. If you're shooting off a barricade, or if you're shooting on the prone, or whatever, off the bench, spend some time improving your position. Marksmanship, marksmanship, marksmanship. Your horse is dead, it's turned into glue. Take that away from this class, please. Don't forget about marksmanship. So, wind is considered a non-deterministic variable, right? So that's just a fancy way of saying it cannot be expected to occur with certainty. So the wind is a constantly changing thing. It changes. It's changing right now. It's changing direction. It's changing velocity as I speak. So it's unlike an elevation setting that a solver can give you, which can be very, very accurate, and they can be fairly finite if all of your inputs are correct. Wind, not so much. So you have to have a certain type of flexibility when you're thinking about the wind. You can't get locked into a solution and go, well, that's not the solution. I wish it's right. It's going to change. So for me, I think about like 4 different things when I come out to a range. First thing is, what is the speed of the wind? That's the first thing. I got out of my car this morning and I felt the wind. I'm like, okay, if I can feel it on my face, that's a certain number, right? For me, if I can just feel the wind, like a light wind, I know it's at least 4 miles an hour, 3-4 miles an hour, right? If I can hear the wind in all of my ears, me personally, I know that I'm around 7 or 8, right? I once did an experiment. I stood flat on a runway, and I closed my eyes and I put my arms down like that. And at 13 to 14 miles an hour, the wind actually pushed me onto my heels a little bit, right? All those little things, they all mean something, right? So, but that's our first experience, is speed of the wind. Now, we have a lot of tools we can use for speed of the wind. We can use physical effects, right? And there's a million lists out there, right? I mean, you open up any marksmanship manual from like 1952 all the way up to like a modern U.S. Army sniper manual, and you're going to find in there a list. Hey, from 0 to 2 miles an hour, smoke will drift. From like 3 to 5 miles an hour, the wind can be felt on the face. And then maybe dust will drift, right? Like 5 to like 7 or 8, you'll see small leaves start to move and grass bend. And there's a sort of progression of wind speed and physical effects. I don't have really one memorized, because the problem with that it's not a problem. The issue with that type of relationship of physical effects and wind speed is here in Blakely, Georgia, or in the summertime, we like to call it the Devil's Underpants. And like if you live out in, Arizona, Phoenix, Arizona, and the vegetation that you might have out there in the range, do those 2 types of worlds, the vegetation, do they react the same? No.
It adapted to its environment.
Right. So wherever you live, wherever you're shooting, you need to figure that out. Spend some time observing. So when I was at Fort Benning and I had young soldiers, and it was great being in charge, had a bunch of privates running around. It was awesome. They could make little problems go away like ants. So I would actually grab a private and like, all right, man, I give him a radio and I give him a kestrel and I'd send him down range. Like, go down there and stand next to that bush. Right? Then I'd look through binos or a spotting scope, and I would look at the bush or the tree or the grass where he was standing, and I would try to put a number on the wind. Like, okay, so grass is kind of doing this, and the tree's kind of doing that. That looks like 8 miles an hour. Like, hey, Schmuckatelli, how much is the wind blowing? He put a kestrel up in the air. He's like, it's 10.5, Sergeant. I'm like, oh, okay. Not 8. 10.5. That's 10.5. All right, man. Move over there and do the same thing. Then I'd send my guys out to do it with each other. And that's actually a really good training tool. You and a shooting buddy, just walkie-talkies or on a cell phone, get apart from each other and try to guess the wind where they're at. Right? Learn those skills. And that's a perishable skill, too. I practice it all the time, even unconsciously. Like, if I get out, I live outside Seattle, like 20 minutes from Seattle. So when I'm not dodging a homeless dude or some Antifa guy, stepping over a Antifa guy. So
They're not homeless, they're urban campers.
That's right. No, I know. So they're all camping too. It's like being in the field your whole life. It's awful. I'm originally from New York, just outside the city. And like, I'm used to homeless dudes with the cardboard teepee thing or sleeping in the subway. But out there, they're all camping. I mean, even though I spent a lot of time in the field in the Army, I freaking hated it. It's awful. So anyway, sidebar. So I get out of the grocery store and I'm looking at the mirage that I could see off the top of cars in the parking lot. I'm looking at the giant flag. I'm looking at the giant flag that's blown in the air. I'm always trying to put a number on. I'm looking at the tops of trees. I have lots of pine trees around where I am, so I know when I see the top of the pine with these fir trees that we have out there, when they start moving like that, it's at least 12, 13 miles an hour. Right? So I'm always trying to put a number on the wind. Good skill to develop. Right? You have a kestrel. Kestrel is a great tool. Part of a kestrel is an anemometer, the wind meter. So I saw you taking some wind measurements before, right? You were getting what? 6.6, 6.5 as an average, right? Which probably was maybe a little stronger than you thought it was going to be.
I thought it was weaker.
Weaker than you thought it was? Right, so like, I mean, right now I threw it up there before and I had about 4.9 or 5, right? And that was just like, and I could just barely feel the wind every once in a while. Like those little gusts, like that one right there, that's your 7-ish. Now that paper flipping over, it's probably about 8, right? Again, use that as a quick thing. So speed. Wind speed coupled with wind direction affects how much your bullet drifts in very basic terms. So obviously, intuitively, what is the most wind effect that you're going to get when in terms of direction of the wind? So let's think of a clock where 12 o'clock is our direction of fire, right? 3 o'clock is direction to our right, 9 o'clock is direction to our left. So say we have kind of a left wind today, right? Right? So left wind. So on our clock direction, from 12 o'clock to 9 o'clock, what's the most effect wind that we're going to have? 9 o'clock wind, right? So the next thing to do is you have to find that direction. How do you find direction? Well, you can do what I just did, throw some grass in the air. You can use mankind's first wind meter, the Mark 1 Mod 0 wind meter. You lift your finger and you put it in the air, and whatever side of your finger gets cool is the direction the wind is blowing, through the evaporative property of cooling. It works really well, actually. You just got to, I would use only your own finger. It's not a team exercise. Unless you have a high degree of confidence on where your partner's finger has been. I don't. I'm a suspicious guy on finger stuff. Put that out there. Especially since COVID, you know. So you can do that. You can use optics to find the direction of the wind. And we don't have a lot of mirage today. Mirage is what we use to find direction of wind with optics. And can anybody tell me like a layman's? I know I got some super smart guys out here. There's always a couple of you guys like lurking. But can anybody give me like a normal person's definition of what say mirage is? When we say the word mirage, what is it? Yes.
The heat waves coming off.
The heat waves come off. Exactly. They are what looks to us like heat waves, and it's just the air is being refracted because of like the temperature of the air relative to the temperature of the ground, and a lot of things go into creating that mirage. There's Frank and I were just talking earlier. Frank Alley. He has an enormous amount of mirage in Alaska where he does a lot of his training because the air there is so humid. He's right near the coast. So if you have a lot of moisture in the air, if you have a high contrast, and that's what we don't really see a lot today, typically you'll get a ton of mirage here at Blakely, almost seeably so. But there really isn't that really bright sun type of stuff. You see a lot of mirage off of snow, actually, a lot, right? And so the mirage is just air, and you're focusing your optic, and you kind of see this distortion. So by the best way to say look at mirage with a scope is you focus on your target, and you actually back your focus up about not halfway, but maybe a couple hundred meters shy of your target. So you're basically focusing on the air closer than the target, and then you'll see that stuff kind of pop out. And yeah, so I'll focus on the target, and like a range like this is a perfect way to kind of show that. So, you know, if we were shooting at targets down by where those numbers are, like I would maybe focus my scope on that number board so I can see the numbers clearly. And then they have these berms. They also have flagpoles down there. So like that first flagpole is probably like 200 yards from the target. So that first flag, the very far flag you can see is probably 800 yards away, and those numbers are 1,000 yards away. So I might focus on the numbers and then back focus my scope until one of those flagpoles was crystal clear. Then my target would be maybe just a tiny bit blurry, but I will then see the mirage a lot more clearly, right? You just got to be careful. Some optics, like some scopes, the focuses are different, right? So like traditionally, a lot of the old-timey scopes, if you focus counterclockwise, you're bringing the focus close to you. And if you focus clockwise, you're bringing your focal length farther away from you. Some are different, are opposite, right? So like binos might be opposite. Like a Night Force spotting scope might focus a different direction on the knob than a Vortex, or a Leupold, or a Zeiss. Just make sure you know which way your optic focus. That happens to me all the time, by the way. But sometimes you might mess it up and do the wrong direction. And there is a thing that happens sometimes with optics. When you focus past the target and there's a lot of mirage, sometimes that mirage apparently flips direction. It actually happens. So, have you seen that happen? Like, I've seen it happen multiple times. And that could ruin your whole day, right? If, like, all of a sudden, it's Bizarro World, and instead of Superman being cool, he's a jackass, that's a problem, right? So, yeah. So with the mirage is literally blowing, the wind is blowing that air. So that's what we see in the mirage. So the one thing you always tell with mirage is what we call a no wind effect, or what the also called a boil, right? So you can see it. That's when you can like really see the mirage, heat waves or something off of like a car really close. You just kind of see them going straight up in the air, right? When I used to live here in Georgia, I lived up in Columbus for 15, 16 years. You could see it all the time, like on the road, just the heat just kind of sitting there, right? Yeah. That's easy. Oh, I knew that was going to happen. So that's easy to see. You can see that pretty easily. What's hard with mirage is if you open any shooting book that talks about using mirage and wind reading, an old freaking Sergeant Smith that had a secret mirage thing that he would look at to tell him it was 14.5 minutes of wind, is what the waves look like when they're being blown left or right. That's really hard to do. It's really hard to estimate speed on mirage by looking at what it looks like. You can do it, but it takes a lot of time looking through the scope. Okay? And there's all kinds of people who tell you, well, when the mirage is doing about like a 45-degree angle, that's like 4 to 6 miles an hour. And when it's like about a 30-degree angle mirage, that's 2 or 3 miles an hour. And when it's kind of 90 degree, that's like 8 or 10 miles an hour. And there's always pictures. You guys see pictures and books about mirage? None of that stuff ever looks to me like what mirage really looks like. I'm like, what the hell? That doesn't look like anything like that. I mean, video is probably the best way of doing it, but usually when you take video of mirage, you try to upload it, it gets compressed, and you can't even see the mirage anymore, right? So, again, that's something you can learn, but mirage is really good for telling you, hey man, is it blowing out of the left or the right? That's a good indicator. Sometimes that's all you can do. Like, I shoot up in Idaho with Brian Morgan's place. I go out there sometimes and help him, and he's up in these mountains in like the Seven Devils Canyon area in Idaho, and like you're shooting 2,000 yards up at a 25-degree angle across 2 different ridge lines, and your target's like 2 or 3 terrain features away. And sometimes, like, the hell with getting it within 1 or 2 miles an hour. If you can figure out if it's left or right, like, that's a fantastic job. Sometimes the mirage is good just for that, right? So what I'll do is I'll rotate my spotting scope. So I'll take the spotting scope. So I know the wind's kind of coming from this direction. And we'll do this with spotting scopes. If we can see mirage, we'll do it here in class. But I'm looking down here, and I can see the mirage coming out of the left. Again, pretty easy to find out. Go look at it. What I'll do is I'll slowly start turning my scope into the wind until I find the boil. Like St. Royal's right there. That's the wind direction. That's like having a wind flag. Like everybody, everybody kind of makes fun of and I did it for years, the prone shooting stuff where they have wind flags up, it's golf course type shooting. Like, you're not gonna have a wind flag in freaking Afghanistan, dude. Why are you like, I can't. But you got a wind flag. You've got an optic. You do it with your rifle optic. You do it with a set of binos. You do it with a spotting scope. It's the most accurate way. So once you have a direction, you've pretty much already cracked the code. Once you have the direction of the wind and you have the wind speed, you have cracked the code. So the easiest way to think about the wind is in a clock direction. Think about the clock direction. And so for my purposes, let's just talk about 12 o'clock to 3 o'clock and like 12 o'clock to 9 o'clock. Because if I have a 1 o'clock wind, I'm going to get a certain amount of drift from right to left. And if I have an 11 o'clock wind, I will have the exact same amount of drift, except from left to right. And if I have a wind from 7 o'clock, I'm going to have the exact same amount of left to right drift as if I had a wind from 1 o'clock. Does that make sense? So we don't really have to talk about what's the angle of a 745 wind. We can just talk about wind, say from 12 o'clock to 3 o'clock, and apply it all the way around. Does that make sense, everybody? So, my full value wind is, say, 3 o'clock. That's 100%. And we use the clock system. And what I like to do is try to break it down to a half an hour on the clock. So, before I even say that, you have to know how much your rifle is going to drift in the wind. You have to have a source of data for any of this stuff to work. Kestrel, use your app. Lockwood's got a free app. There's Streetlock. There's a million apps out there. They all give you pretty good solutions. I use Applied Ballistics app. But you can get solutions everywhere. You have to have a starting point for your data. And that starting point is usually the full value wind effect. Now, if you have a Kestrel, you can actually use that Kestrel as a target engagement tool. You can put everything in there. Hey, the wind is coming from X o'clock at X miles per hour, and I'm at X amount of yards, and my elevation is X, and my wind is Y. You can enter all that in. You can. You can use that and you can use a solver as an engagement tool. Or you can use it as a data point, as a reference point. So I can kind of be flexible. And there's lots of shortcuts and ways to memorize wind data. And there's a million of these things out there. Like Todd Hodgett has a really great thing that he uses, and it's actually in the Kestrel now, his quick win formula that he came up with. So there's lots of tools that you can use that'll give you a wind number at a certain distance. But that wind number is usually always in full value wind. So with that number, I have to figure out, is the wind always from 3 o'clock or 9 o'clock? Actually, full value winds are fairly rare. They really are. So we have to know clockwise what that wind is doing. And also, I just know from experience, if I'm shooting a 6.5 Creedmoor, right? Anybody here have a 6.5 Creedmoor? Okay. I'm shooting 6.5 Creedmoor with Berger 140 grain at about 2750, right? I know that at 600 yards and less, if the wind isn't blowing at a full-size IPSC, if the wind isn't blowing more than 6 miles per hour, I can hold on the upwind hedge and hit every single target. I don't have to make a wind call. If I come out here, what's it, about 6, 7? All right, man, edge, bang, pink, right? If I'm shooting that same rifle at 400, that wind's got to be about 12, 13 miles an hour to push me off the target. So do I need to solve for pi if I'm shooting at a short range engagement? If I'm a military dude and I'm using a 300 Norma and I'm shooting at a target at 700 meters away, Do I have to worry about the wind if it's like less than 9, 10 miles an hour? Probably not. So know that first going in. So I now contrast that. I do some extreme long range shooting. So I got a first round hit at 2 miles, 35-20 yards with a 375 shine tip. First round hit, big 48-inch plate. For that shot, the only time I've ever done it. But for that shot, I mean, I had a compass out. I didn't go find the angle of the wind. I shot an azimuth like that. I shot an azimuth to the target. I computed the sine of that angle, multiplied it by the wind speed that I got off of 3 different wind meters, one of which was downrange. Right? So, like, but is that something that you're going to be able to do running up to a stage of PRS? Excuse me, anybody have the wind data from the, right? So kind of have a gas pedal of what you need to do. So in the, anybody here familiar with the tremor type reticles, they have wind dots and stuff? So you can hit a lot of targets, say 500 yards and closer to you, by just knowing which direction the wind is blowing, right? And then those targets from say 500 to about 800 or 900, you can hit a lot of targets just by using the closest wind dot. So say my wind dot is worth 4 miles an hour in my scope. Hey, I think it's like round 4, hold the 4 mile an hour wind dot, and in upwind edge or downwind edge, hit a lot of targets. Right? You get past that, now you're gonna have to hold in between that wind dot or know the wind speed within a couple miles an hour and the wind direction within about a half an hour. So all that being said, here's a kind of a basic bare bones of the process. We've got our wind speed from whatever mechanism we use. The eyeball, the Mark 1 Mod 0 wind meter, Purell, we got some Purell here for everybody who wants to do that first before you. Wind direction by throwing some grass in the air, looking at anything that's out there. You see a vehicle go by, looking at, you're getting ready to go shoot a stage, and people are shooting. You need to pay attention to which way the dust is blowing from where their shots are in. Like you're getting your rifle ready to shoot, you need to watch the guy or 2 guys ahead of you and see which way the dust is moving, and also see how fast that dust is moving. Another way to get wind speed is just sort of assign a walking or running man value to what you see moving. Like I know, like I went to college in New York City, so I'm walking down 2nd Avenue, and you're in my way because you're a tourist looking for the M&M store. I'm walking around 4 miles an hour, right? I'm on a Army Road March, EIB standard pace, 4 miles an hour. If I'm running a slow jog, the old airborne shuffle, that's around 6-7 miles an hour. That's a 10-minute mile. You see a guy running, jogging, like, wow, that dude's fast. Running about a 6-minute mile, that's 10 miles an hour. So it's pretty easy to assign a speed. So you see some dust moving, like try to figure out how fast that dust is moving. That gives you an idea of wind speed, right? So knowing the speed, knowing the direction, now I have to figure out, well, what percentage of that wind speed is actually affecting my bullet. Now we all know, pretty easy, that 9 o'clock wind today, that's 100%, right? But what's a 2 o'clock wind? What's an 8 o'clock wind? So here's where a lot of people, you go out to the range with somebody brand new, they're always going to underdope the wind. They're always going to put less wind on it than they think. And I've seen it many times, many years I was at Camp Perry, Ohio, shooting the national championships, and you see a guy out there at 1,000 yards, and he's like, all right, so wind's about like that, that's half value. And the guy's pointing about 1:30 or 2 o'clock. Because it makes sense intuitively, you think, okay, if full value is 3 o'clock, and 0 value is 12 o'clock, right, a boil, then half value should be 1:30, right? Halfway between 12 and 3 o'clock. That is not the case. Wind angle is not linear. It's trigonometric. So essentially, It's the sine of the angle relative to you and to the bullet. So if I had Brian Litz here, the way he would explain it is that as a bullet is going down range, the cosine of the angle of the wind relative to the bullet's flight sets up a crosswind vector of force that makes the bullet move that direction with the wind. Okay? Another thing that people don't really realize, and I don't either, I didn't really for a while. So you see a weather vane, there's a weather vane's pointing to the wind, correct? Well, guess what? When your bullet goes down range, the tip of your bullet points into the wind. I thought when I first started out that as your bullet was going like that, it would just kind of go like that and blow it left to right. That's not what happens. Your bullet actually weather vanes slightly into the wind. And that's actually what causes it to drift away from the wind, because you're setting up another vector. Draw a little right triangle to the wind, and because of the way the bullet it's spinning in flight and going this way in flight, pushing this way, it's like that old Mr. Wizard experiment. Like you push on the spinning bicycle wheel, and like it sets up the force thing that goes the other way. Same thing with a bullet. I have a buddy that flies Little Bird helicopters for the Army, and they shoot rockets out of those things. Guess what happens with rockets? They fly upwind because it weather vanes into the wind, but it has thrust. Now, a bullet doesn't have thrust, but a rocket has thrust. So it's like, and he was a shooter. He's like, yeah, man. First thing I had to learn, because they do all that stuff like it's old school. Like some of those guys will take a grease pencil and put a grease pencil crosshair on their windscreen, and they use that to aim with. And they're scary. Like those guys could put a rocket in a shoebox, just doing that. Fanatics, right? It's like, yeah, but you actually have to aim downwind because it has thrust. If you shoot an arrow in the wind, you'll see it. It'll turn upwind. Now it'll still drift, but the point will be upwind. So what that really means is the minute that the bullet leaves the barrel, it starts moving that direction. And it's never coming back. Never coming back. So I had a guy that used to shoot for me. He was from some little town in who gives a crap, Texas. And I think his actual name. And he told me, he's like, man, the bullet never leaves the barrel and says, F it, I'm going upwind. I'm like, that's pretty good. He also said, it ain't never not worth nothing. So you figure that logic bomb out. That's like Captain Kirk would use that to blow up a robot on Star Trek, right? It ain't never not worth it, but it has to be worth something. If it's not worth it, so it's always worth something, right? If you see anything out there, it's worth something, right? So the way that the angles work is pretty simple. And I'll just give you guys the numbers that I use. I'll tell you the right numbers, but I'll give you the numbers that I use first. So if you're going to write anything down in this class, write this down. So if we just go about the clock on a half an hour system, 12 o'clock wind, 0%. 12:30 wind. Now every half an hour on the clock is 15 degrees, right? It's 90 degrees at 3 o'clock, right? It's 6 degrees at 2 o'clock. It's 30 degrees at 1 o'clock. 0 degrees at 12 o'clock, right? 12:30 is 15 degrees. 1 o'clock is 30. 1:30 is 45 degrees. 2 o'clock is 60. 2:30 is 75 degrees. And 3 o'clock is 90. So that's how the numbers that I use and have memorized. You can memorize it too. It's pretty easy. It's every half an hour what it's worth. So 12 o'clock is 0. 12:30, 15 degrees. That's not a lot, dude. So I got a compass on my iPhone here. All right. So this range points at around, at least on my phone, about 8 degrees back at it, right? So on that about 8, 15 degrees on there, it should be about 23. That's a 12:30 wind. Look at my scope. That's worth 25% of the wind speed. Wouldn't think it, but it is. 15 degrees. one of these fancy Garmin Tactics Delta things on, but I actually have the fake analog screen on here so I can do this. So I find the boil there, I'm like, that's my target, that's a 1 o'clock wind. That's why I do that. 1 o'clock wind, 30 degrees, 50%. That's half value. Right? You know how you can prove it? Take a calculator. So you know, on an iPhone, when you take the calculator and turn it that way, it turns into a scientific calculator, right? Yeah. You know why that is? It's because of me. I invented that. This is a real story. This is a real story. So my wife's cousin and her husband both worked at Apple in the early 2000s. They have both since retired. They sold stock, retired. They're like 45 years old. Anyway, he was one of the guys. He's like the software dude. First iPhone. So they came. They stayed with us when we lived in Columbus, Georgia. They went. You know those Volkswagen bus things, right? They bought one to drive it back to San Francisco. Of course they did, right? So anyway, they found one in Georgia that wasn't completely rusted out. So they're staying with us, and like iPhone just came out. It's like 2004, whatever that was. Hey, yeah, I had. Hey, what do you think about the iPhone? I'm like, hey man, I like it. Hey, you know what? I said, you know, I use a lot of trig in my job. You know, doing ballistic stuff in the Army. Like, we need a scientific calculator. He's like, yeah, we're coming out with an app. I'm like, yeah, but you know, on your Mac thing and on like some other stuff, like you turn it and it turns into something else. What if you just turned it and it became a scientific calculator? He's like, that's not a bad idea. The next update came out. I should get a penny every time somebody does that. I won't be in GD Blakely, Georgia right now, I'll tell you that. So anyway, or I would. Anyway, but if you type in an angle, say 30 degrees, I type in 30, I hit the sine button, the sine of 30 is 0.5. So that's your 50% win. Okay, so if I go to 130, 45 degrees, the sine of 45 is actually 45, it's 0.707 or 0.71. Emil, former dumb infantry guy, that's 75% win. Round up like 4%. If you miss the target because of 4% win, that's a pretty low percentage shot anyway, right? So 130, 75%. If I go to 2 o'clock win, that's a 60-degree win. The sine of 60. Someone do it for me. Make sure you're in degrees, not radians. That's a whole other conversation. Should be about 0.87 or something like that. 0.866. Round up to 0.87, right? Emil Praslick math, that's 0.9. That's 90% win. A 2 o'clock win is 90%. So I've got a Kestrel, stick it up here. It says 10 miles an hour. Let's keep it simple for the class. 10 mile an hour win. What's 90% of 10? 9 miles an hour, right? That's a 9 mile an hour full value effect or crosswind effect on the wind. That's what your dope. That's what you have to go with your dope. If you have wind dots on your scope, your reticle. Hey, if I have 4 mile an hour wind dots, then I'm going to use just under 2 wind dots, right? If I go to 230, 75 degrees. Someone type in 75 and hit a sign button.
965.
0.965 or 97%. Praslick calls that 100%. And actually, Praslick thinks that anything past 2 o'clock, I call 100%. So once the wind hits 2 o'clock and anything past 2 o'clock, I call that 100% win. So whatever I'm measuring, feeling, observing, that's what I use for my data. So if you memorize anything, guys, the numbers that, so you don't really need to have a whole wind chart memorized. Okay, you can say, and here's one last thing before I get off this topic. So memorize 0, 25%, 1:30, 1 o'clock 50%, 1:30 75%, 2 o'clock 90%. Anything past 2 o'clock is 100%. Pretty easy. That's going to get you scary close on almost every target. Now, how do we use that percentage number? Well, you can do it one of two ways. First way, depends what kind of data you're dealing with. So, I can actually compute a mile per hour crosswind effect from that, or I can just use that percentage of my dope. That's probably the easiest way of doing it. So if my dope says I need a 1 mil hold, and I've got a 2:30 wind, I've got a 2 o'clock wind, then I need how many mils? 0.9, right? Because it's 90%. Yes, sir.
So probably that'd be even greater if you have multiple targets.
Good, very good question or observation. So, if your direction of fire changes because you're on a stage, you have an array of targets, you need to keep track which way the wind is blowing. Right? So, if I was shooting a stage where some targets are over there, and like my last target is here, like I might start off full value, and then by the time I get over to here, I'm working on about a 80% or so wind. So I'm gonna have to take wind off as I start shooting more in line with the wind direction, either from the back or the front. Yeah, so be aware of your orientation to the target for sure. So, wind speed, wind value, and then that'll give you a percentage. Now, you can take that percentage and apply it to your dope, but again, you're not going to be able to reference that dope unless your organic wind computer up here can know how many miles per hour it is and what direction it is. That's the key to the kingdom. And then once you've shot a shot and you hit a target, you've got it licked. If they're all fairly in the same orientation, so like I did some wind coaching stuff at King of 2 Mile a couple different times, right? And there's actually like a TV show, or you can find it on YouTube. You'll probably see me, my fat ass up there, like behind the Applied Ballistics teams, right? And if you don't know what's happening, this looks like magic. So our first target was like 1,550 yards, right? Now using a 375 Chi-Tech, I mean, thing's an animal, right? Shooting a 400 something grain solid bullet at like 2,900 feet per second, right? At about a mile, reading wind stat is like reading wind with a 308 at about 700 to 800 yards. Okay, it's a significant upgrade. So, you know, I'm trying to put a number on it. I'm like, it's this, maybe it's that. Let's get close. Start in, I'll say, hey man, let's run 1.5 mils, right? First shot, yeah, it just clips the right edge. I'm like, okay, we need 1.2, hold 1.2, whack, right in the middle, whack, right in the middle. We come off of that distance, and we needed 1.2 mils. You ever see me spotting in a competition like that, I'll have two things. I'll have a little notebook, and I'll have a little cheap solar calculator, power calculator. Now, what I'll have written down, or what I'll know, either by looking at a Kestrel or just know, is what was 1 mile per hour or 10 mile an hour effect at that range. So with that 375 Chi-Tech, on that day, each 1 mile per hour was 0.12 mils of wind, right? And a mil is an angular measurement. I'll talk a little bit about that before we get out of here. So the wind is mil is an angular measurement like a minute of angle. So I need 0.12 mils. Well, we hit with 1.2 mils. So what was the wind speed? If a 1 mile per hour wind is 0.12, and I needed 1.2, 10, right? I'm like, all right, man. 10, I know internally 10 mile an hour wind because I just confirmed now I missed the first wind call. I was off by like 1.5, 2 miles an hour wind, right? but I got that win number. We went out to the next target, it was like 1,896 yards or whatever. And I told, it's like either Derek or Brian Litz, I'm like, and I knew, I looked at my little book, and it said 0.185. I'm like, and I thought it picked up like a mile an hour or two. I'm like, 2.1. Pow! Center shot. And was like, what? And it looks like I know what I'm doing. But that is such a very simple thing to do. I mean, it's just arithmetic. And that's like, use that stuff. Like, so use whatever you can to get that data. If you guys are shooting together, competition, or just out horsing around, plinking, whatever, what I would say to you is that communication between shooters, and you see it a lot. Guy comes off the stage, hey man, how much wind you use? Right? Guy's like, I used 0.9. Now, if you're shooting a 6.5 Creedmoor, and I'm shooting a 308, and or even more, you're shooting a 300 PRC, and I'm shooting a 223, right? And we both, the stage is at 800 yards. I'm like, hey man, how much you use? You're like, I use like 0.1. I'm like, okay. I shoot 0.1. It's like, yeah! I'm like, come on, dude. So, a better way to communicate that is always talk in miles per hour. I would encourage you to do that. How much would you use? Man, I needed about 6 miles an hour. Now that's data that I can use and you can use, right? Not mils, not minutes. And every time you guys shoot a stage or come off of a range, what I also encourage you to do is figure out what that wind speed was. Backwards math it. Use your Kestrel. Kestrel is an amazing tool for that because you've got a ballistic solver right in it, right? So you're like, okay, everything that I saw, I took Abel's class, we were all out there, and that jackass said it was worth 2.5 mils, and I thought it was, and we only needed 0.9. He sucks. So you end up, you type in 0.9, you keep moving the wind speed until the Kestrel says you needed 0.9. That was the actual wind speed. You should do that all the time. Because that's your thing. That's me sending a private downrange with a radio. Hey, what was the wind speed? I'm like, oh, okay. And I thought it was like 13. You're saying it's only 6? Oh, I see. So it's 13 here, but there was like a tree line that starts 100 yards away from me and completely protected the target all the way down from the wind. So on this range, we used to shoot some competition stuff on this range back when I was in the Army. And if the wind's out of the right, and you're all the way down there, all the way at the end of the berm, do you think you're using as much wind as me if I'm here and the wind's going this direction? No, because it's protected by the trees, right? You have to look at that little tunnel right in front of your bullet, all the way down range.
So when you're backwards in that math, you're getting the cumulative wind value between you and the target, not an absolute value in any place.
No, an aggregate wind value. Where that's actually how, they're trying to develop devices right now where you press a button and it interrogates the wind somehow. Photons. I was part of one of these Army programs through DARPA. So they flew me out to Lockheed Martin. One of these meetings, they're designing this machine. Like, we need somebody from the Army to come out and talk about the wind. So I went out there. I had to leave the meeting for like 90% of it because I wasn't cleared. I didn't have a high enough clearance. All I heard was photon. I'm like, okay, you guys come from here. Photons. But anyway, through photons or ball bearings or whatnot. However, but that's what those machines do. That's what the technology does. It sort of interrogates the wind and gives you a cumulative average. Now, the wind, you should look at the range by sections. That's another good way of doing it. Terrain, rarely is the terrain uniform all the way out to the ground. So I'll talk a little bit about terrain stuff, then we're going to jump on these optics. And sun's out, so we should see some mirage. ever been. So you see what I just did there looking at the sun? You know what's funny? When you buy a brand new, at least a Cowa spotting scope and some other spotting scope, there's a little tag on it. And there's like a picture of a dude looking at the sun through a spotting scope and like a little Ghostbusters like, don't do that. And I was like, who would they do that? Then I went to Afghanistan to train the Afghan army, and I had some binos, and the guys goes, hey, bossman, can I see your binos? I'm like, yeah, sure, bro. And I look over, and the dude's staring at the sun. I'm like, ah. So anyway, I just did that. But anyway, your first, think about the distance to the target in thirds. First third, middle third, last third. There's a great article written about this. You should all read it. So if you go to nnovembervisti.com. So Nick Vitalbo, Nvisti, that's his company, and he's got another guy, Dan Perriard, who's an engineer, and they wrote they have a PDF. It's free. Read the article. It's basically where the wind matters, where the winds affect that range. So they were one of the guys that were working on this device, and they're still working on a device. But in order to see if you have a device that works, you have to figure out what the wind is and all these different to see if things working, right? So they built this whole system of remote wind meters that they could telescope up like 20 meters in the air and measure the wind like every 50 meters out to 2,000 meters and track wind speed and direction all the way out there and see if their device was working, right? That thing was connected to a ballistic solver, all kinds of crazy shit. But they learned a lot about first third, middle third, last third. So there's lots of different theories and opinions on this, and there's actually some arguments to be made for all of these, like where the wind matters. So first third of the wind of the range. Well, as soon as your bolt leaves the barrel, the wind blows on it. Like I said, bullet never looks at the wind and says, "The hell with it, I'm going upwind," right? So if the bullet starts getting pushed to the right, immediately it's going to basically you alter the trajectory, right? It's now pointing. Your bullet now is going to the right of the target forever and ever. So the more input you have on that bullet at the muzzle, the more downrange effect, right? It's like if you have a guy being a compass guy at Ranger School and he sucks and you're off 10 degrees, by the time you walk a couple kilometers in the woods, you all want to kill that guy, right? So that's an argument for the first third. The middle third, well, what happens to the wind speed the higher up you go in the air? Does it slow down or speed up? Speeds up, right? Like you lie on the ground, you're like, doesn't feel that bad. You stand up to spot for the next guy, you're like, oh man, it's actually blowing up here. So that's called wind gradient. So, and there's a relationship that the higher you get off the ground, the higher the wind speed is. So if you're shooting really far away, for example, a 308 at 1,000 yards, depending upon the bullet and the trajectory and everything else, your bullet is anywhere from about 12, 13 to about 15, 16 feet above your line of sight to the target. It's up there, right? So, depending on the terrain, that could mean a big change of wind speed or a little change. Here, pretty flat, we got some berms. I would say that from the ground to maybe the height of your bullet at 1,000 yards in 308, the wind speed probably picks up maybe 5%, maybe 10% highs. So do you have to add anything to that wind call? Not so much. I'm shooting a 308 at a mile. Now my bullet is probably 30 feet in the air, 40 feet in the air. Should I add some wind to what I'm measuring here at head height? I probably should, right? It's hard to be precise with that because it really depends on the terrain. Do some study. There's actually some really good articles on Wikipedia about wind gradient, wind shear. They actually delve into different types of terrain and how the roughness of the terrain, how it affects it, right? So the rougher the terrain, the more protected the ground is going to be relative to when it's going to be up in the air, right? So that's an argument for the middle third. The final third, well, the bullet's slowing down in flight, right? The bullet's affected by two things in flight: drag and gravity. Gravity is a constant force. Drag makes a bullet slow down. So the last third of the bullet actually spends the longest time in the last third. So how a ballistic solver computes wind drift is by time of flight. That's how they do it. So you have the longest time of flight in the final third. Okay, and I know plenty of old-timey golf course long-range guys. They're like, man, I always watch those far wind flags. That tells the story. So the reality is, you look at the science, look at the numbers. That first third in transonic, so out to about transonic, so that's when your bullet hits about Mach 1.3-ish. The first third is about 50% of the wind. The second third is about 35% of the wind. Your final third is maybe 15, 20. Now, as you start stretching it out, that middle third and the final third start being weighted greater. So, the easy button for me as a shooter, all that the easy thing, I look at the first third, that's easy to see. We can focus our optic easily on the Mirage within the first third. And then I just take a quick look. It's the second third, agree with the first third in terms of terrain. If that's the case, then I just kind of look where I'm at, to be honest. But read that article. They show it in a graph form where, you know, it's kind of on you have a curve, and they actually measure the area underneath each section of the curve along the X and Y axis. And you can compute effect that way. Pretty interesting. They're math guys, I'm not. I was a failed English major. That's why I went back in the Army. Like, this sucks. So let's talk about, in terms of tools you guys can come away with, let's try to find some Mirage. Let's try to find a Boyle. Or let's try to look and see if we can see Mirage, right? So I'm looking downrange now. See if I can. Oh yeah. So, what's the best way to look at Mirage with a scope? The answer, low power. So, a lot of people, if you get a Brady spotting scope and it goes with 60 power, whoop, 60 power, man. So, usually, if I'm working with somebody, if I'm teaching, and the guy's like, I don't see Mirage, man, I'll walk up almost every single time. They've got that little loop-holed spotter, and they got the thing cranked to 40 power. I'll back it down to 15 power or 20 power, and you'll see the Mirage just kind of jumps out at you. You can do a lot of fantastic spotting with binos, like those Vortex binos. I think the big ones are like maybe 15 or something power. The small ones are probably 10. 10 to 15 power, you see a tremendous amount of rock. So what I want you guys to do is we kind of need to team up on these optics. There's what, about 8 or 10 of the things. 3, 4, or 5 people, grab them, get yourself some space. What you're going to want to do is make sure it's set at a low power, probably the lowest power it is, and look down there and see if you can see Mirage. And you should be seeing it coming out of the left, right? Come a little out of the left. Slowly turn your scope or your binos until, go back and forth until you see Mirage. Play with the focus to be focused on that area out there. And then once you've got that, take your watch or whatever and look at that angle. That's your percentage right there. So let's all try to do that exercise if you can. And then I'm going to talk about these Vortex Furies and the Kestrel and how to kind of do a shortcut.